The silence in the office shattered when a blind employee's fingers, trained to read the world through touch, brushed against her new CEO's hand. "Those scars," she gasped, her face turning pale. "You're the boy I saved from the fire." "Hello, my dear friend. My name is Alexander, and I tell stories without filters, where emotions are raw and every tale touches the soul." Before we begin, I invite you to like, comment, share this video with someone special, and subscribe to the Crossroads of Fate channel so you don't miss a single story that could change how you see life. Stay until the end, because this story will surprise you. Thank you for watching, and a heartfelt thanks to the channel members whose names are on the screen. Your support makes all of this possible. I wish you a beautiful day, and may God bless you and your family. Let's begin. The silence in the office was broken when Elena heard the firm footsteps approaching down the hallway. Her fingers paused on the Braille keyboard as a strange feeling ran down her spine. She had been working at this company for many years. She knew the sound of every footstep, every voice, every sigh that echoed in these walls. But these steps were different, new. Elena was a beautiful woman with wavy brown hair, which she always wore in an elegant bun. Her eyes, though unable to see, shone with an intelligence and warmth that captivated those who knew her. Despite being blind since birth, she had become the most efficient employee in the accounting department, able to detect errors others missed and memorize figures with astonishing precision. The glass door opened, and Elena felt the atmosphere change. A powerful presence had entered the office. The murmur of conversations abruptly ceased, and she could hear her colleagues straightening up in their chairs. "Good morning," a deep, authoritative male voice said. "I am Julian Mendoza, the new CEO of this company." An inexplicable shiver went down Elena's spine. There was something about that voice that sounded vaguely familiar, like a distant echo from a half-forgotten dream. Julian was an imposing man, tall and athletically built. His dark hair was perfectly slicked back, and his gray eyes had the coldness of steel. He wore an Italian suit that probably cost more than any employee's annual salary in that office. "I want to meet each of you," Julian continued, starting to walk between the desks. "This company needs drastic changes, and that includes evaluating the performance of all personnel." Elena heard him approaching step by step. Her hands began to tremble slightly over the keyboard. There was something about the man's energy that deeply disturbed her, though she couldn't explain why. Vicente, her cubicle mate and one of the few employees who truly cared about her, leaned toward Elena and whispered, "The new boss looks pretty intimidating. They say he fired half the staff at his previous company." "Elena Ruiz," Julian's voice asked, now very close to her desk. "Yes, sir," she replied, rising gracefully and extending her hand in the direction of the voice. What happened next would change both their lives forever. When Julian's hand touched hers, Elena felt something that made her gasp audibly. Her fingers, trained to read the world through touch, immediately detected the irregular textures on his skin. Scars. Very specific scars that her hands knew all too well. Unable to control herself, Elena grabbed Julian's hand with both of hers and began to trace the marks with her fingers. Her face went pale, her eyes filled with tears, and her whole body began to tremble violently. "It can't be," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I know these scars." Julian tried to pull his hand away, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of Elena's reaction. But she held on tighter. The entire office had fallen into complete silence. Everyone watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Ms. Ruiz, please let go of my hand," Julian said in a tense voice. But Elena seemed to be in a trance. Her fingers continued to trace the scars with a familiarity that defied all logic. There were 3 main marks, one running from the wrist to the knuckle of his middle finger, another in the shape of a half-moon on the back of his hand, and a third, smaller but deep, between his thumb and forefinger. Suddenly, Elena lifted her head toward where she knew Julian's face was, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "It's you," she cried out in a voice that resonated throughout the office. "You're the boy I saved from the fire." Julian's face crumpled. The color drained from his cheeks, and for a moment, the mask of authority and coldness he always wore completely shattered. His gray eyes filled with an emotion he had been repressing for years. "That's impossible," he managed to articulate. but his voice no longer sounded convincing, not even to himself. Elena continued to hold his hand, her fingers now trembling as she kept exploring the scars she had last touched so many years ago, when they were fresh, bleeding wounds on the hands of a terrified boy. "The scar on your wrist," Elena said in a shaky voice. "You got it when you tried to grab the hot metal frame of the window. The half-moon one was from the broken glass when we finally managed to pull you out. And this small one," she touched the mark between his thumb and forefinger softly, "it was where you cut yourself on my ring when I carried you downstairs in my arms." Every word Elena spoke was like a direct hit to Julian's heart. The memories he had buried under layers of success, money, and power began to emerge like an emotional tsunami. "No," Julian whispered, taking a step back. "It can't be true." But the precision with which Elena had described each scar, every detail of the fire that had forever marked his childhood, was impossible to refute. Suddenly, fragments of memories began to rush back. The smell of smoke, the scorching heat, the screams, and most of all, the voice of a woman who had whispered words of comfort to him as she carried him to safety. "Your name was different then," Elena continued, now with more confidence. "You were called Michael Santos. You were only 6 years old." Julian's world reeled. Michael Santos had been his name before he was adopted by a wealthy family who gave him a new identity, a new life, and new opportunities. He had buried his past so deeply that he sometimes wondered if it had ever truly existed. "You lived in the apartment building on Moon Street," Elena continued, each word confirming what they both already knew in their hearts. "It was an old 5-story building. The fire started on the first floor, in Don Ramon's bakery. You lived on the 3rd floor with your grandmother." Julian fell heavily into the nearest chair. The mention of his grandmother was the final blow. Maria Santos, the only family he had known until that terrible night, the woman who had died in that fire while he was being rescued. "My grandmother," he murmured, the words barely audible. She didn't make it out." Elena nodded slowly, tears still streaming down her cheeks. "I know, my boy. I know." The office remained in complete silence. Vicente and the other employees watched the scene in awe, not fully understanding what was happening, but recognizing that something profoundly significant was unfolding before their eyes. "How is it possible that you're here?" Julian asked, his voice now as vulnerable as a lost child's. "How is it possible that, after so many years, we're working in the same place?" Elena smiled through her tears. "There are forces in this world that connect us in ways we can't understand. All these years, I've thought about you. I wondered what had become of that brave boy who clung to my hand as we went down those smoke-filled stairs." "I wasn't brave," Julian said, shaking his head. "I was terrified. If you hadn't shown up—" "But I did," Elena interrupted gently. "And you survived. You became this successful, strong man. That's what matters." Julian looked at Elena with new eyes. This beautiful, serene woman, who had been his guardian angel in the darkest moment of his life, had been working under his roof without him knowing. The irony was overwhelming, and at the same time, it seemed too perfect to be a coincidence. I need air," Julian said, getting up abruptly. This is too much." But before he could walk away, Elena spoke again. Julian, is there anything else you need to know about that night? Something they never told you?" Julian stopped dead in his tracks. "What do you mean?" Elena hesitated for a moment, as if she were wrestling with herself over whether to reveal a secret she had kept for decades. "The fire," she said finally. "It wasn't an accident." Elena's words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The fire wasn't an accident. Julian felt the ground move beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about his past, everything he had built on that tragedy, suddenly seemed to be teetering. "What do you mean it wasn't an accident?" he managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. Elena looked toward where she knew he was. Her sightless eyes were filled with a deep sadness she had carried for decades. "There are things a child shouldn't know, things that adults decide to hide to protect their innocence. But now you're a man, and I think you have the right to know the truth." Vicente, who had been watching the entire scene in silence, approached discreetly. "Do you want some privacy?" Julian nodded, grateful for the consideration. In a few minutes, the office had emptied, leaving only Elena and Julian in a silence charged with emotions and secrets yet to be revealed. "Sit with me," Elena said, her voice soft but firm. "This story is long, and some parts are difficult to hear." Julian pulled up a chair and sat in front of her. His hands were still trembling slightly. Elena extended her hand, and he, after a moment's hesitation, took it. The contact seemed to calm them both. "To understand what happened that night, you need to know my story," Elena began. "I wasn't always blind. I lost my sight when I was 15 in an accident that also changed my life forever." Elena had been a vibrant, lively teenager with dreams of becoming a teacher. Her parents worked long hours at a factory, and she often stayed home alone, taking care of her younger brother. One night, while she was preparing dinner, a gas explosion in the neighboring building sent her flying against a window. The glass fragments permanently damaged her eyes. "The first few years were terrible," Elena continued. "The anger, the despair, the feeling that my life had ended before it had truly begun. But little by little, I learned that losing my sight didn't mean losing the ability to see. I developed other senses, other ways of perceiving the world." After a long rehabilitation, Elena had moved to the building on Moon Street. It was a humble place full of working-class families who struggled to make ends meet. There she met Julian's grandmother, Maria Santos, an older woman who had become her confidant and closest friend. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman," Elena said, smiling for the first time since she had started the conversation. "She had a wisdom that came from suffering, but also a kindness that had never soured." Despite the hardships, Maria Santos had raised her grandson alone after the boy's parents died in a car accident. She was a strong but sickly woman who worked cleaning offices at night to support her grandson. Elena had started helping her by bringing her food when she was too weak to cook, and by taking care of little Michael when Maria had to work extra shifts. "You were a special child," Elena recalled. "Very smart, always asking questions, always trying to understand how the world worked. Your grandmother was very proud of you. She used to say you would be someone important someday." Tears began to roll down Julian's cheeks. The memories of his grandmother, which he had buried under years of success and ambition, began to return with painful clarity. "She always told me that studying was the only way to escape poverty," Julian murmured. "She made me do my homework every night, no matter how tired she was." "Yes," Elena nodded, "and that's why what happened that night was even more unfair." Elena took a deep breath before continuing with the hardest part of the story. "A few weeks before the fire, I had started noticing strange things in the building. Well-dressed men who didn't belong in the neighborhood regularly visited Don Ramon, the bakery owner. Conversations would abruptly stop when I passed by, and there was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. Don Ramon had been struggling financially for months," Elena explained. "The bakery was his life, his family inheritance, but it wasn't making enough money. One day your grandmother confided something that was very worrying to her. Maria had overheard a conversation between Don Ramon and one of those well-dressed men. They were discussing insurance, about accidents that could solve financial problems. Julian's grandmother, with her protective instinct, had begun to suspect that something terrible was being planned. She tried to confront Don Ramon," Elena continued, her voice now trembling. "She told him she knew what he was planning, that he couldn't be allowed to endanger all the families in the building. Don Ramon got scared. He begged her not to say anything. He promised he would cancel everything, but it was too late. The men behind the plan weren't the type to accept having their plans canceled. When they found out that Maria Santos knew too much, they decided the accident had to happen before she could talk to anyone else. That night," Elena said, her voice now barely a whisper, "your grandmother came to my apartment. She was terrified, but also furious. She told me she had decided to go to the police the next morning, no matter the consequences." Julian's grandmother had confided everything to Elena, how Don Ramon was being blackmailed by dangerous loan sharks, how the plan was to burn the bakery to collect the insurance, and how they had threatened him to keep silent, but she wasn't going to stay quiet. "Your grandmother was a woman of principles," Elena said with pride in her voice. "She couldn't live knowing that other families might die because of the greed of a few men." Elena paused, clearly struggling with the next part of the story. Julian waited patiently, although every fiber of his being screamed to know the rest. That same night around 2 a.m., I woke up to the smell of smoke, Elena continued. At first I thought someone was burning trash, but the smell quickly grew stronger. I went out of my apartment and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The flames had already consumed most of the first floor when Elena reached the hallway. The smoke was dense and suffocating, and she could hear panicked screams coming from the upper apartments. Her first instinct was to flee, but then she remembered that Maria and Michael lived on the third floor. I couldn't see, but I knew that building like the back of my hand, Elena explained. I had gone up and down those stairs thousands of times. I knew exactly where every step, every railing, every door was. Elena had started climbing the stairs, guiding herself by touch and sound. The smoke was getting thicker and the heat more intense, but she kept going. On the second floor, she helped a family with small children find the exit. On the third floor, she went straight to Maria's apartment. When I got to her door, it was locked, but I could hear screams from inside, Elena recounted. I banged on the door shouting, but the noise of the fire was deafening. I finally managed to force the door open. What Elena found inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Maria Santos was unconscious on the living room floor, clearly overcome by the smoke. Michael, little Julian, was huddled in a corner, crying and screaming his grandmother's name. I knew immediately there wasn't time to save both of them, Elena said, tears flowing freely. Now the flames were climbing the walls. The building was collapsing. She had to make an impossible decision. Elena had taken Michael into her arms, promising him she would come back for his grandmother, but when she got to the stairs, she realized it was too late. The structure was collapsing, and going back would mean certain death for both of them. I went down those stairs with you in my arms, and with every step I took, I knew I was leaving your grandmother today. Elena sobbed. It's a weight I've carried all these years, the guilt of not being able to save her too. Julian got up abruptly, walking toward the window. The emotions that had been repressed for decades now threatened to completely overwhelm him. The anger, the pain, the confusion, everything mixed into a whirlwind that was impossible to process. You saved my life, he said finally, his voice broken. You have no reason to feel guilty. But there's more, Elena continued. After the fire, I investigated. I spoke with firefighters, with police, with anyone who would listen. The fire had been clearly intentional. Investigators found evidence of an accelerant, but the case was closed quickly. Too quickly. Elena had discovered that Don Ramon had disappeared the night of the fire. His body was never found, and many assumed he had died in the flames. But Elena had her suspicions. The well-dressed men had also disappeared, and the investigation had been shelved without anyone being arrested. Your grandmother died because she knew too much, Elena said with bitterness. And Don Ramon was probably also silenced for knowing too much. It was a perfect crime disguised as an accident. Julian turned back to Elena, his eyes shining with a mixture of pain and determination. Do you have evidence? Something that can prove what you're saying? Elena nodded slowly. I've kept everything all these years. Testimonies, photographs, documents. I never knew what to do with that information. But something told me that someday it would be important. Why didn't you ever go to the police again? Who would believe a blind woman with conspiracy theories? Elena replied with sadness. Besides, I was scared. If those men had killed your grandmother to silence her, what would they do to me? The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Vicente peeked his head in. Excuse me, but there's someone here who says he needs to speak urgently with Mr. Mendoza. He says it's about a matter from the past. Julian and Elena exchanged glances. Who is it? Julian asked. An older man says his name is Ramon Delgado and that he has information about a fire that happened many years ago. Elena's heart stopped. Impossible, she murmured. Don Ramon is dead. But when the man entered the office, both Elena and Julian knew immediately that, against all odds, Don Ramon had survived. He was older, thinner, with completely gray hair, but his features were unmistakable. Michael, the man said in a trembling voice, looking directly at Julian, I knew someday I would have to face the past. When I saw your name in the papers as the new CEO, I knew the time had come to tell the truth. Don Ramon looked destroyed by the weight of the years and his guilt. His hands trembled as he approached Elena and Julian. Elena, I know you recognize me, he said, his voice broken by emotion. I've come to confess everything, to ask for your forgiveness, for what I did, for what I allowed to happen. The revelation that Don Ramon was alive opened a completely new world of possibilities and questions. If he had survived, what else that they thought they knew about that night was false? Sit down, Julian said, his voice controlled but tense, and tell us exactly what happened that night. This time, we want the whole truth. Don Ramon fell heavily into a chair, clearly struggling with emotions he had repressed for decades. It all started when my bakery began to lose money. My wife was sick, she needed expensive medications, and I was desperate. The man confessed how he had been contacted by loan sharks who offered him a solution: burn the bakery to collect the insurance. At first, he had rejected the idea, but the financial pressure and threats had led him to accept. But when Maria Santos found out and confronted me, I tried to cancel everything, Don Ramon said, tears running down his wrinkled face. I told those men I didn't want to go through with it, that I would find another way to pay my debts. What Don Ramon hadn't anticipated was the reaction of the loan sharks. They had already invested time and resources in the plan and weren't willing to accept no for an answer. When they realized that Maria Santos knew too much, they decided to proceed with the plan that very night before she could talk to the authorities. They forced me to open the bakery that night, Don Ramon confessed. They told me if I didn't cooperate, they would kill my wife too. I didn't know so many people were in the building. I thought most of the families would be sleeping and could escape in time. Don Ramon's confession revealed an even more sinister truth. The fire had not only been intentional, but had been designed specifically to silence Maria Santos. She had been the primary target, and all the other victims had been collateral damage. After the fire, those men took me far away, Don Ramon continued. They gave me a new identity, a little money, and told me that if I ever spoke, they would find me and kill me. I've lived with this secret all these years, moving from city to city, always in fear. Julian felt a cold rage take hold of him. His grandmother had died not because of an accident, not even out of simple greed, but because of a planned murder. She had been a victim of men who killed to protect their secrets. Who were those men? He asked in a dangerously calm voice. Don Ramon hesitated, clearly still terrified after so many years. They were part of a larger organization, loan sharks, but they were also involved in real estate. They wanted to buy the entire building, but the tenants refused to sell. The fire was going to solve two problems: silence Maria and get the building condemned so they could buy it for next to nothing. The magnitude of the conspiracy began to take shape. It hadn't just been about the insurance for the bakery. It had been about real estate speculation and murder for financial gain. There's something else, Don Ramon said, looking directly at Julian. Your adoption was not a coincidence. Elena and Julian were stunned. What do you mean? Julian asked. The family that adopted you, Don Ramon explained, were part of the same organization. They adopted you to keep control over you, to make sure you never remembered too much or asked uncomfortable questions. They thought it would be easier to control you as part of their family than as an orphan who might cause problems later. Julian's world completely fell apart. Not only had his grandmother been murdered, but his entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. His success, his career, his identity, everything had been orchestrated by the very people who had killed his family. The revelation was so overwhelming that Julian staggered and had to sit down. Elena immediately moved closer to him, taking his hand in a gesture of support. But there's something they didn't know, Don Ramon continued with a bitter smile. Something none of us knew until now. What? Elena asked. Don Ramon looked at both of them with a strange expression. The organization that planned all this, that killed Maria, that adopted Michael, is starting to crumble, and the trigger for their downfall is something they never could have anticipated: the reunion of the two of you. Don Ramon's words floated in the air like a prophecy. The reunion of the two of you will be the trigger for their downfall. Julian and Elena looked at each other, not fully understanding the magnitude of what the man had just revealed. I don't understand, Julian said, his voice tense with confusion. How can our meeting affect a criminal organization? Don Ramon leaned forward, lowering his voice as if he feared someone else might hear. Because Elena isn't just the woman who saved you that night. She's the only living person who can connect all the dots. The only one who has the information needed to unmask the entire organization. Elena frowned, clearly confused. What are you talking about, Ramon? I was just a neighbor who helped during the fire. No, Elena, Don Ramon said, shaking his head. There's something you never knew about yourself. Something the organization has been trying to keep hidden all these years. The old man stood up and walked toward the window as if he needed distance to tell what came next. Do you remember the accident that left you blind when you were 15? Of course I remember, Elena replied, unconsciously touching her eyes. A gas explosion in the neighboring building. It wasn't an accident, Don Ramon said, turning to her. It was the organization's first attempt to silence you. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stood motionless, as if Don Ramon's words had physically struck her. Julian instinctively moved closer to her, taking her hand. That's impossible, Elena murmured. I was just a teenager. What could I have known that would threaten anyone? Don Ramon returned to his seat, his expression grave. Your father, Elena, your father worked for them without knowing it. He was an accountant at a company that laundered money for the organization. He had started asking questions, noting inconsistencies in the books. When he got too close to the truth, they decided to eliminate him. Elena felt her world wobble. My father died in a car accident when I was 16, a year after I lost my sight. He was murdered, Don Ramon said sadly. But before he died, he had hidden evidence, documents, records, proof of all the illegal transactions. And he had done something the organization didn't know about. He had trained his daughter to be his backup. Memories began to return to Elena like fragments of a puzzle, finally finding their place. Her father working late at home, teaching her about numbers and patterns. The lessons she had thought were just quality father-daughter time had actually been training. He taught you to memorize complex number sequences, didn't he? Don Ramon continued. He trained you to remember patterns that seemed innocent, but were actually codes. Elena nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I always thought it was a game. He would make me repeat series of numbers until I had memorized them perfectly. He said it was to keep my mind sharp. Your father knew he was in danger, Don Ramon explained, so he transferred all the critical information to the only person he trusted completely, his daughter. But he did it in such a subtle way that not even you knew what you had in your memory. Julian leaned forward, starting to understand. That's why the explosion. They tried to kill her before she could remember or understand what her father had taught her. Exactly, Don Ramon confirmed. But when the attack only left her blind instead of killing her, they decided to watch her. All these years, they have had people monitoring her, making sure she never remembered or understood what she knew. Elena put her hands to her head, overwhelmed by the revelations. My whole life has been a lie. Not everything has been a lie, Don Ramon intervened softly. Your kindness, your strength, the love you have for others, that's real. But they have been manipulating the circumstances around you to keep you controlled. Julian felt a cold fury growing in his chest. And my adoption? How does all this fit together? The family that adopted you, the Mendozas, are the leaders of the organization, Don Ramon revealed. They adopted you not out of kindness, but to keep you close. They knew that someday you might remember something about the fire, and they wanted to control you. But there was also another motive. Don Ramon paused as if he were gathering the courage for the next revelation. They knew Elena had survived and suspected she might have valuable information in her memory. They thought that if they raised you in their family, they could use you as a way to get to her if it ever became necessary. Are you saying they planned for us to meet? Elena asked, incredulous. Not exactly, Don Ramon said. Their original plan was different. They were going to use Michael, Julian, to get close to you when it was necessary. But then something unexpected happened. Don Ramon smiled for the first time since he had started his confession. Julian broke away. He became his own man, successful and independent. He moved away from the adoptive family and created his own company. This wasn't in their plans. Julian remembered the years of conflict with his adoptive family. how he had felt that something was fundamentally wrong with them, how he had fought to become independent despite their attempts to control him. When Julian bought this company where Elena worked, they panicked, Don Ramon continued. They realized that fate had brought their two biggest threats together without their direct control. Biggest threats? Julian asked. Julian has the power and resources to investigate his past, Don Ramon explained, and Elena has the information that can destroy them. Together, you are unstoppable. Elena was silent for a moment, processing everything she had heard. Then she slowly began to speak. The numbers, she murmured. All these years, I've had nightmares with sequences of numbers. I thought it was trauma from the accident, but... What numbers? Julian asked urgently. Elena closed her eyes, concentrating. 4789211563987421. The sequence came out of her lips like a memorized prayer, fluid and automatic. Don Ramon went pale. Those are bank account codes. Your father taught you the numbers of the accounts where the organization hides its dirty money. There's more, Elena said, her voice growing stronger. Many more, names too, dates, as if my mind were a living archive of their entire operation. Julian got up, walking toward the window as his mind worked furiously. We have to do something with this information. We can't just stay here knowing what we know. It's dangerous, Don Ramon warned. If they find out Elena has remembered, or that I've spoken, they will kill us all. It's too late to worry about that, Julian said with determination. The damage is done. Now we have to make sure the truth comes to light. Elena joined Julian at the window. My father died trying to expose the truth. Your grandmother died because she didn't stay quiet when she knew something was wrong. We can't dishonor their memory by staying silent now. At that moment, Vicente knocked gently on the door and entered with a worried expression. Mr. Mendoza, there are several men in the lobby asking for you. They say they're from your adoptive family and need to talk urgently. Julian, Elena, and Don Ramon exchanged tense glances. How many men? Julian asked. 4, Vicente replied, and they don't look like they're here for a friendly meeting. They found us, Don Ramon murmured, clearly terrified. They knew I would come here eventually, Julian said, taking control of the situation immediately. Vicente, is there another exit from this building? Yes, the emergency exit in the back. It leads to the alley. Perfect, Julian said, taking Elena's hand. We're going to go out that way. But first, Julian went to his desk and began making quick calls. In a few minutes, he had contacted an investigative journalist he knew, a lawyer specializing in organized crime, and a contact at the FBI. I've sent messages to 3 different people with all the information we have so far, Julian explained as they prepared to leave. If something happens to us, at least the truth won't die with us. But Elena had a different idea. No, she said firmly. We're not going to run. It's time to face this head on. Elena, it's too dangerous, Julian protested. I've lived with fear my whole life without even knowing it, she replied with a determination that surprised both men. I'm not going to keep running. If those men want to talk, then let's talk. Don Ramon looked terrified. You don't understand. These people kill without a second thought. Then it's time they face the consequences, Elena said, heading toward the door. Julian followed her, admiring her courage but worried for her safety. If we're going to do this, we'll do it together, and we'll do it intelligently. When they reached the lobby, 4 men in expensive suits were waiting for them. Julian immediately recognized one of them, Eduardo Mendoza, the man who had been his adoptive father all these years. Eduardo was a tall, distinguished man with perfectly coiffed gray hair and cold eyes that showed no emotion. Next to him were 3 younger men, clearly bodyguards. Michael, Eduardo said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, what a surprise to find you here with old friends. My name is Julian, he replied firmly, and these aren't old friends. They are the people you tried to destroy. Eduardo ignored the comment and addressed Elena directly. Ms. Ruiz, right? I've heard a lot about you over the years. Your father was a very talented man. Elena didn't back down from the implicit threat. My father was an honest man. That's why you killed him. Be careful with accusations you can't prove, Eduardo said softly, but his voice carried a clear threat. Oh, but I can prove them, Elena replied, surprising everyone. 478921 63987 Does that number sound familiar, Eduardo? Eduardo's face went pale. It was clearly a code he recognized and didn't expect to hear. And there's more, Elena continued. I have names, dates, bank account locations, transaction records, everything my father compiled before he was murdered. Are you lying? Eduardo said, but his voice no longer sounded as confident. Julian stepped forward. Why don't you tell Elena about the night of the fire, Eduardo? Why don't you explain how you ordered my grandmother's death to silence her? Eduardo looked at his bodyguards, clearly considering his options. The office lobby had several security cameras, and employees from other floors were occasionally passing by. It was not the ideal place to resolve this with violence. This isn't going to end here, Eduardo said finally. You don't understand who you're dealing with. Oh, I think we understand perfectly, a new voice intervened. Everyone turned to see a man in a government suit approaching with an FBI badge. Behind him were several more agents. Agent Rodriguez, FBI, the man introduced himself. Eduardo Mendoza, you are under arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and first-degree murder. Eduardo tried to protest, but the agents were already handcuffing him. This is ridiculous. You have no evidence. Actually, we have quite a bit of evidence, Agent Rodriguez said, smiling. It turns out someone sent us very detailed information a few hours ago. Bank account codes, names of accomplices, transaction dates, more than we need to build a solid case. As Eduardo and his men were arrested, Julian looked at Elena with admiration. How did you know the police would come? Elena smiled. When you said you had sent information to several people, I realized it was the perfect time. I called the FBI while you were talking to the journalists. I told them I had information about a criminal organization and that they were about to try to silence me. Don Ramon, who had been watching everything from a corner, approached slowly. Is it really over? He asked in a trembling voice. It's over, Agent Rodriguez confirmed. With the information we have and the testimony of the three of you, we'll be able to dismantle the entire organization. The following months were a whirlwind of investigations, trials, and revelations. The information Elena had memorized turned out to be even more extensive than anyone had imagined. Her father had been meticulous in documenting all the organization's illegal activities and had trained his daughter to be a living archive of evidence. Eduardo Mendoza and his accomplices were sentenced to long prison terms. The organization that had operated in the shadows for decades was completely dismantled. Dozens of bank accounts were frozen, properties were confiscated, and other members were arrested. Don Ramon, after testifying against the organization, was finally able to live in peace. The government provided him with a new identity and protection, but for the first time in decades, he didn't have to constantly look over his shoulder. Julian discovered that much of his wealth had come from illegal sources through his adoptive family. Without hesitation, he donated all that money to charity and started over with his own company, built on honest work. But the most profound change was in the relationship between Julian and Elena. The shared trauma in the search for the truth had united them in a way that transcended the extraordinary circumstances of their reunion. A year after the trial, Julian found Elena in her office, working at her desk as always. But now something was different about the atmosphere. The tension and fear had been replaced by a peace that neither of them had felt before. You know what's the strangest thing about all of this? Elena said, looking up from her work. What? Julian asked, sitting in the chair in front of her desk. All these years, I thought my blindness was my greatest disability. But it turns out it was what allowed me to develop the extraordinary memory we needed to get justice, Bon. Julian smiled. My grandmother used to say that everything happens for a reason, even if we don't always understand what that reason is at the time. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Elena said, extending her hand toward him. Julian took her hand, feeling the same scars that had reconnected them after so many years. But now, instead of representing pain and trauma, those marks had become symbols of survival and triumph. Elena, Julian said, his voice full of emotion, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. What is it? That night when you saved me from the fire, did you realize your life was also changing forever? Elena reflected on the question for a moment. I think in that moment I was only thinking about saving you, but looking back, yes, that night connected us in a way that destiny would take decades to fully reveal. And now that we know the whole truth, What do we do with that connection? Elena smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face. Now we build something new, something based on truth, on justice, and on the love we've found through all this adversity. Julian stood up and walked to her, taking both of her hands in his. Elena Ruiz, you saved my life when I was a boy, but more than that, you gave me back my life when I was a lost man. Would you like to build a new life with me? Tears began to run down Elena's cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I would very much. As they embraced in that office where it had all begun, they both knew they had found something that was worth all the struggle, all the pain, and all the searching. They had found their home in each other. 2 years later, Julian and Elena were married in a small but beautiful ceremony. Don Ramon, who had become a father figure to both of them, walked her down the aisle. Vicente, the co-worker who had witnessed the encounter that changed everything, was the best man. Julian's company had grown and prospered, but now it operated under completely different principles. Elena had become his partner, placing integrity, honesty, and mutual care above profit. On their honeymoon, as they walked along a beach at sunset, Elena stopped and turned to Julian. "You know what I've been thinking?" she said. "What?" "That maybe blindness wasn't a curse after all. It allowed me to see things others can't see. It allowed me to recognize you through touch when my eyes couldn't. It allowed me to memorize information that saved a lot of people." Julian took her in his arms. "And maybe losing my grandmother and living that whole lie wasn't completely in vain. It brought me back to you. It allowed us to get justice. It allowed us to save other people from suffering what we suffered." "Then we agree," Elena said, smiling. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually the things that prepare us for the best things yet to come." "We agree," Julian replied, kissing her softly. As the sun set over the ocean, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, Julian and Elena knew they had found something rare and precious. A love forged in adversity, tempered by truth, and sustained by the hope of a future built on solid and honest foundations. The story that had begun with a tragedy had ended with a triumph. The story that had begun with a separation had ended with a union, and the story that had begun with secrets and lies had ended with truth and justice prevailing. Don Ramon, now in his golden years, often visited the couple at their new home. One afternoon, as he watched Julian and Elena work together in their garden, he smiled with satisfaction. "Maria," he murmured, looking up at the sky, addressing Julian's grandmother who had died so many years ago. "Your grandson found his way back home and found love in the process. You can rest in peace now." The wind blew gently through the trees, as if it were a response, a blessing, a confirmation that the circle had finally closed. Julian and Elena had learned that sometimes the deepest scars become the sources of our greatest strength, that sometimes getting completely lost is the only way to truly find who we are, and that sometimes justice can take decades to arrive, but when it finally comes, it's worth every moment of the wait. In the end, they had not only found the truth about their past, they had found hope for their future. And in a world that often seems full of darkness, they had shown that light always finds a way to shine through the cracks, especially when it comes from true love and the courage to do what's right. Their story had become a legend in their city, a reminder that no matter how powerful those who do evil are, truth and justice will eventually prevail, and that sometimes encounters that seem accidental are actually appointments with destiny that have been waiting a lifetime to manifest. Years later, when people asked Elena how she had known immediately that Julian was the boy she had saved, she would smile and reply, "The heart recognizes what the eyes cannot see, and hands that have touched a soul at its most vulnerable moment never forget that connection." And when they asked Julian how he had found the strength to face the organization that had controlled his life, he would reply, "When you have someone by your side who has already shown they will be there in your darkest moments, you find courage you didn't know you had." Together, they had shown that true love is not just an emotion, but a transformative force capable of changing destinies, correcting injustices, and creating miracles that last a lifetime. And so the blind employee and the CEO lived not just happily ever after, but they lived with purpose, with truth, and with the deep satisfaction of knowing they had honored the memory of those they had lost and had built a legacy of justice that would benefit future generations. I hope you like the story. Today I have something new. If you like my narrations, I'm sure you'll also love my new prayer channel, Prayers with Alexander. Come with me to praise God with prayers full of faith every morning and every night. The link is up here in the card and also in the pinned comment. I'll be waiting for you there. I would also love to know what you thought of this story. Tell me in the comments. And now on your screen, another exciting video is appearing that will surely surprise you. Tap to keep getting emotional with stories that touch the soul. See you there for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Crossroads of Fate family.